Hey guys, Taki here. The long-awaited Powkiddy X18s is finally here, and today I'm going to do a first impressions video on the device. The full review will be released soon, but I wanted to get this out to cover some of the important aspects of this rather strange product launch. The Powkiddy X18 was actually supposed to launch very early this year, and I talked about it in a video that I did on a tablet that uses this processor. At that time, there was talk that this would sell near the $100 price range. The current price is unfortunately not close to that range, but with their RGB 10 Max selling for $120 with significantly cheaper hardware, the X18s was obviously going to have a high price. Dollar for dollar, this makes their own RGB 10 Max a bad value because the X18s provides more than 5 times the performance as the RK3326. The Powkiddy X18s comes with a Unisoc T618 CPU with 2 Cortex-A75 cores and 6 A55 cores clocked at 2 GHz. For GPU, we have a Mali G52 clocked at 850 MHz, 4 GB of RAM with no spec given, but it should be LPDDR4X, and 64 GB of internal storage, no specs on that either. For connectivity, we have Bluetooth 5.0 and support for 5G Wi-Fi. The X18s uses a 5.5-inch 720p IPS display with support for HDMI video out, and it is powered by a 5000 mAh battery. As of the making of this video, the X18s retails for around $170. At this price range, the only real competition this has is the Udon Lite, which is significantly more powerful, but I would argue that these two products are in two completely different segments of the market. Now, I'm not ready to pass full judgment on the X18s, as that will come in the full review. I would say that there is a huge deficit of clamshell devices, and if one is done right, I do think it could justify a higher price tag compared to more traditional products in this market. In order of power and performance, we have the Powkiddy X18, the GPD XD Plus, and now the X18s. Judging from how fast Powkiddy sold out of their first trial order, there seem to be a lot of people like me that have been waiting for something with more power in this form factor. I hardly get a chance to talk about it given the lack of device releases, but I really like clamshells. I have a DSi XL, a Japanese 3DS XL, and a Japanese new 3DS XL with dual IPS screens. If you like these kinds of handhelds, you know their pros and cons, and I'm going to talk about a few of them in this video. Before getting into that, I want to talk about the build of the X18s. For those of you that don't know, the X18 is actually a device that I reviewed a while ago. I reviewed that device late in its life, and I was able to get Powkiddy to get their provider to release a software package with Google Play since that product didn't launch with Google Apps. A similar situation is happening here with the X18s, which I'll talk about later in this video, but for the most part, what you're getting here is exactly the same with some minor differences. When I learned that Powkiddy was planning on reusing this mold to do a product refresh, I hoped at a minimum no component would be worse than the ones used in the original device. I'm still on the fence over that. Here we have the retro-inspired X18s with a warm gray shell. We have a red LED light on the center of the lid that you can control in the software. I'll show you that right now. It's kind of hard to see because it's still light outside, but you can see that we have a pulsating light around the center icon. On the top, we have stacked shoulder buttons on the left and the right side, an SD card slot, HDMI out, and a Type-C port. The only change from the original device on the top is this updated Type-C port. There is actually one other change that I noticed when I was first starting to use this device. The X18s uses switches that make less noise, which is a welcome change over how loud the original ones were. Moving on over to the front, we have a headphone jack in the center, surrounded by speakers on the left and the right sides. Before looking inside, I wanted to do this profile shot to point out a problem that other devices have, where you can press down in certain spots on the screen and have the buttons press against the screen, transferring over any fingerprints that you might have. It might not happen to you if you keep this in a case, but it's a little annoying having to clean the screen. Every good clamshell needs to have good actuation of the hinge, and I wanted to just showcase the angles that this opens up to. From closed, your first position is just a bit over 90 degrees, and from here you just have one more click. It will not go back more than this, and it can't go forward that far either. This angle is good enough for most uses, and the hinge, while not the best, seems like it will hold up to use. In fact, my original X18 is completely fine after having it for well over a year now. On the opposite side, we have the GPD XD Plus, which has a really stiff hinge that is prone to snapping, but it does give you the most options for the opening angle in this market. The real king is the 3DS, which has a really nice angle for its first position, and another great angle for its second. It can actually go further, but it isn't terribly useful for me unless I'm laying down. Just like the X18s, we have the same amount of movement in our clicked position. It looks flimsy on camera, but I've never had any problem with this. Let's take a look at what we have inside. First, we have everyone's favorite logo, dead center. I'll talk more about that in a moment. We have a D-pad, colored ABXY buttons, start and select in the center, dual analog sticks on the top, back, home, task view, power, screen mapping, volume down, and volume up. We also have a red LED indicator light on the bottom right side. On the topic of just this, since people really hate the Powkiddy logo, I actually asked if they could completely black this part out on this product refresh. I will just say that if you really don't like the logo, you can rip this off and flip it over after cleaning off the glue. In no order of importance, the first thing that I want to talk about here is the D-pad, since there have been a lot of comments on this D-pad and the one in the original. This D-pad uses conductive rubber, and while it's far from the best, you know you're getting input in each direction when you press down, and the feeling of the button is reasonably uniform in all directions. The original D-pad was a lot stiffer and less uniform. If you are really going to make something where space is limited, you almost have to go with dome switches like the ones used in the 3DS to save space. Or you need to put in the effort to get decent travel length in a small package with conductive rubber like the Switch Lite. Now between this and the Switch's D-pad is clearly better, so that should give you an indication of what we were working with, but they are both usable. So our D-pad improved by changing the rubber that was used to one that is softer, but that means that our ABXY buttons also became softer. And these guys were something that wasn't really bad in the original device, but they have clearly gotten worse. I would say now that they are a tad too soft, yet this is only a problem if you had both devices to compare. I don't think this would bother someone with no frame of reference to go from. The button just gives way too easily and it doesn't push back hard enough. Another thing that you're going to need to know is that these analog sticks do not click. These are more closely connected to Vita analog sticks with a different rubber cap on the top than the ones used in the Switch Lite. You have enough travel length to do what you need with unfortunately no L3 or R3 support. In terms of being able to use and enjoy this device, really everything is here. You can get to any of the input options by making small movements with your hands, and you can also switch between the top and lower half without thinking too much. I want to point out quickly that my A button is messed up and I've been told that this is not normal. If you get something like this, please tell me because that means I was lied to. The next important thing that I want to talk about here is the brightness levels on the X18s, and I put together a comparison for this using several devices. First we have the XD Plus, the original X18, the X18s, the new 3DS XL with IPS screens, and the Switch Lite. If I really try to exaggerate the differences by lowering my camera's ISO, you can see the differences between the 5 units. You can see the X18s has a different color temperature than the X18. The brightness level is not really that big of a difference. Compared to the Switch Lite, yeah, there is a big gap there. And there is a big gap between the X18s and the GPD XD Plus, although that device's screen is less pleasing on the eyes. If I don't exaggerate the camera, this is exactly how the screens look to my naked eye. Just for comparison, you can get an idea for how 100% brightness on the X18s translates over to the brightness slider on the Switch Lite. Moving on to the operating system, this is how the Android 11 image will look when you first try to use it, and yes, it is that bad. Things are broken up into various sections, but not all of the apps will correctly populate inside this launcher. There are various settings that you can control here, and interestingly enough, there's a button mapping switch that you can use like the one that Udon uses, but it does not seem to work here. Thankfully, you can completely ditch this launcher for the standard one, and you will never need to look back because it works as it should. The only thing that you are left with is a rather ugly pink pull-down menu that doesn't make any sense. Finally, I will just point out that I am using the GMS version of the 18s that I had to flash myself. The base system supports OTA updates, and I have received an OTA update while I had this device, but I am told only the non-GMS firmware will get OTA updates, and this is the most disappointing part of this entire release, as I do not see many people using the version of this with no Google Play access. It makes no sense. Let's move on to something a bit more positive. One of the biggest challenges of making a clamshell gaming device like this is how to deal with heat. Traditional phones can dump heat into the frame of the phone, push it through the LCD, or dump it into your hand and use your body as a heatsink. Clamshells like these have no screen to dump processor heat into, nor do any of these have metal frames that they could use to absorb heat. They can either dump heat into the battery, which would be a terrible idea, or push the heat into the top of the bottom half. The only problem with this is that you will always feel the heat when you are gaming because you are the heatsink. I have a thermal showcase using Pascal's wager on all 3 devices. I did a 10-minute gaming test running these games on each device with the same settings. This isn't going to be GN's level of accuracy, but I hope you can get an idea of where the heat areas are on these devices, as well as an idea of their rough operating thermal loads. First, we have the XD Plus with a hot spot of around 55 Celsius, with the bottom half at around 40. The lower powered X18s is around 39 C on the top, with almost no change on the bottom. The X18s has a thermal spot that goes up to 41 Celsius on the top, all while running this game the best out of these 3 devices. This is thanks to the more efficient 12 nanometer process. As I've mentioned, the X18s comes with screen mapping software that you can access with a press of the G button inside any application. This software actually looks identical to the mapping software used in the XD Plus, and to a lesser degree, the software used inside the XP. It is a rudimentary implementation that lacks a lot of customization, but it is a serviceable option. To map out your buttons, you just drag the icons over to the actions that you want them to do. I'm just going to map these the way that I typically do, and then I will be able to press any of my map buttons for input. A long-standing problem with this software is that it stops working the moment you touch the screen with your finger. It's really annoying, and I wish that they would fix this going forward. I feel like you can kind of get an idea of where the X18s is coming from. It has some good changes and not so great changes, but the most important thing is that it has top-notch gaming performance. While clocked very low, the 2 A75 cores are putting in a lot of work when it comes to native Android games and more difficult emulation that was not possible on the original device. If we're talking about only handhelds that have already shipped to customers, the X18s is currently the second most powerful gaming handheld with built-in controls behind the Mochi i7S, finally outseating the Mochi i7 from 2017. I would say that it is a transitional product between Tier 3 and Tier 4 emulation, as it has a Tier 4 processor, but doesn't quite have a GPU to match it. I'll see how far I can push this by the time I do my full review. If there is something that you would like to know about this, please let me know down below, and while you're there, consider leaving a like on this video to support my work. I'll catch you here next time with another review. Happy gaming everyone, Taki out.